My 11-year-old granddaughter looked at me and whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" I didn't answer her. Because days earlier, I stood in the dark and heard my own son say, "The old man won't last the year. And the girl, we'll deal with her." In that moment, I understood everything. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was already deciding what to do with her after I was gone, like she was nothing more than a problem to remove. And that was the moment I stopped protecting my son and started preparing to destroy everything he thought he controlled. Before we begin, it means everything that you're here. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but everything it's trying to tell you is worth hearing. The morning I decided to let my son believe he had won was a Monday in October, and the oak trees outside my window had just begun to turn. Not red yet, just that first pale warning of gold that shows up before anything dramatic happens, the kind of color that says something is coming, but doesn't tell you what. I had been watching those trees for 31 years, from this same chair, in this same room, at this same hour. I knew every stage of their changing. I had learned over time that the most significant shifts never announce themselves loudly. Neither would this one. The library on the second floor of Harmon Estate was the one room in the house that had never been touched by a decorator. Every other room had been updated at some point. New paint, new curtains. Eleanor's doing always tasteful, always right. But this room she had left alone. She understood, without my ever saying it, that a man needs one place that belongs entirely to him. The shelves along the east wall held my medical texts from the 70s, Gray's Anatomy, Harrison's Principles. A full set of surgical reference volumes I hadn't opened in 15 years, but could not bring myself to remove. Beside them, 3 decades of business files organized by year in dark green binders. And on the shelf closest to the window, sealed inside a glass case with a small brass latch, a violin. A 1962 German-made instrument that Eleanor had played every Sunday evening until the Sunday she couldn't anymore. I had not opened that case since the morning of her funeral. I was not sure I ever would. At 6:45 in the morning, the light coming through the east-facing window was thin and gray, not enough to read by, but enough to see the room, enough to sit in. I had been awake since 5, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I had made a decision sometime before dawn, and once a decision of that weight is made, sleep becomes beside the point. I was thinking about Eleanor, not the Eleanor of her last years, the quiet, diminished version of her that illness had left behind. I was thinking about Eleanor at 42, standing in the kitchen doorway on a Saturday morning, watching our son play in the backyard. Dorian had been 8 years old. He had found a bird's nest that had fallen from the oak tree and was examining it with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Eleanor had watched him for a long time without speaking. Then she had turned to me, her voice low the way it got, when she was saying something she knew I might not want to hear. "Watch that boy carefully, Ev. He counts everything, even kindness." I had smiled and told her she was reading too much into a child's curiosity. I told her every smart kid went through a phase of needing to understand the value of things. I told her Dorian was just that kind of thinker. I had been telling myself versions of that same story for 36 years. The truth, the version I had been avoiding since long before Eleanor died, was that she had been right from the very first sentence. Dorian did count everything. He counted it carefully, methodically, and without sentiment. I had watched him do it his entire life and found reasons every single time to call it something else. Ambition, drive, practicality, the necessary edge of a man who wanted to build something in this world. It was not until last Wednesday night that I ran out of other names for it. I had been coming down from the second floor around 10 o'clock just to check that the side door was locked before bed. Something I did every night out of habit, not necessity, because Pete Marlowe, who had managed security at the estate for 11 years, was more thorough than I would ever need to be. The hallway below was dark. Dorian had arrived earlier that evening unannounced, as he had been doing with increasing frequency over the past several months. He had told me he was staying overnight. I had not argued. I heard his voice before I reached the bottom of the stairs. He was in the front sitting room door, halfway open phone pressed to his ear, not whispering. He had no reason to whisper. He believed I was already asleep. The old man won't last the year. We need to be positioned before Silas locks anything down. I stopped on the fourth step from the bottom. The wood was old and sometimes creaked, but I had lived in this house long enough to know which boards were safe. A pause. Then, the girl is the complication. We'll deal with that when the time comes. I stood there for another full minute. Not because I was paralyzed. Not because what I was hearing was beyond my ability to process. I had been a surgeon for 34 years. I had trained myself to stay completely still in the moments when stillness was what the situation required. I stood there because I needed to be certain I had heard everything, that there was nothing else coming, that what I had just heard was in fact the complete picture. It was. I went back upstairs the same way I came down, slowly without sound. I went to bed and lay there with my eyes open until 4 in the morning, looking at the ceiling of a room I had shared with my wife for 28 years, thinking about the precise difference between disappointment and clarity. By the time the sky began to lighten, I had made my decision. That had been 5 days ago. Now, I sat in the library in the dark that was slowly becoming morning, and I did not feel angry. Anger was an emotion I had largely outgrown by the time I turned 60. It was expensive, imprecise, and it gave too much away. What I felt instead was something closer to the focused calm that used to settle over me in the first moments of a complex surgery. The kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the deliberate management of it. At 6:50, I heard the familiar sound of Henrietta's footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, even with the particular rhythm of someone who had walked that same corridor thousands of times. Henrietta Voss had been the estate's head housekeeper for 22 years, a role that in practice meant she knew more about the functioning of this house than anyone alive, including me. She knocked once, a formality she maintained regardless of circumstance, and pushed the door open. She set the coffee on the corner of the desk without a word. Black no sugar in the white porcelain cup that had been mine for as long as she had worked here. She did not ask how I had slept. She did not comment on the dark or on the fact that I had not turned on the lamp. In 22 years, Henrietta had learned with a precision I deeply respected, exactly when conversation was not what was needed. She left as quietly as she had come. I looked at the coffee. I looked at the photograph beside it, Eleanor at 58 taken on the back porch the summer before she got sick, laughing at something just outside the frame. I had never known what she was laughing at. I had asked her once and she said she didn't remember. I had kept the photograph anyway because whatever it was, it had made her look like that. And that was enough. I opened the center drawer of the desk and took out a sheet of plain white paper. I uncapped my pen, a Parker fountain pen Eleanor had given me for our 30th anniversary, and wrote 2 words in the center of the page: Vincent Crowe. Outside movement caught my eye. Pete Marlowe was completing his 6:45 perimeter check, moving along the east side of the property with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had done this so many times, it had become something close to meditation. He passed the window, slowed, almost imperceptibly, and glanced inside. We looked at each other for a moment through the glass. I gave him a single nod. He held my gaze for 1 beat, then moved on. No words necessary. None had ever been between Pete and me when it mattered most. I set the pen down and looked at the name on the paper. Then I looked at Eleanor's photograph one more time. I had spent 40 years making precise cuts in operating rooms and boardrooms, in conversations where the truth had to be delivered in a way that people could survive receiving it. Every one of those cuts had required the same thing: knowing exactly where to place the blade, and having the steadiness not to hesitate once you had decided. One more, this one just needed to be the most precise of all. He wants the house, Eleanor. Let's make sure he gets exactly what he deserves. I waited until after breakfast to make the call. Some news deserves a full stomach, even when the news is a lie. Breakfast at Harmon Estate had been the same for 40 years. Toast black coffee, 1 apple eaten slowly and without the radio. Eleanor had started that tradition. She believed the first hour of the morning belonged to quiet, and that a man who couldn't sit with silence before 9 o'clock wasn't fit to handle much of anything after it. I had kept the habit long after she was gone, not out of sentiment, though there was some of that, mostly because she had been right. I finished the last of the coffee at 10:25, set the cup down, looked at the phone on the table beside the window, the same window that looked out over the front drive, where the last of the morning mist was still lifting off the lawn. Then I picked it up and dialed Dorian's number. He answered on the second ring. "Dad?" His voice carried the particular alertness of someone who had been expecting a call, or at least had been thinking about one. I kept my tone even, measured. It was the voice I had used for 34 years in operating rooms and consultation offices, the voice trained to deliver information that people needed to receive without falling apart in front of you. "Dorian, I need to tell you something. Dr. Kitt and I met last Thursday. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. His personal assessment gives me 6 to 9 months. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. I counted. Old habit from years of watching patients process difficult news. The length of the pause told you more than the words that came after it. "Dad?" The right tone, the right weight on that single word. Then, "I'm so sorry." 3 words, the correct 3 words, but no intake of breath before them, no roughness in his voice, no catch in the throat that comes when something hits a person before they have time to arrange their reaction. What I heard was language chosen by someone who had already considered what the correct response would be. Not feeling performance. And Dorian had always been an excellent performer. The second question came 12 seconds later. "Have you talked to Silas yet? About the will the estate arrangements?" Silas Underwood, my attorney of 26 years, the man who held every legal document I had ever signed. That was Dorian's second question. Not, "Are you in pain?" Not, "Can I come up this weekend?" The estate, the arrangements. 12 seconds after hearing his father had 6 months to live. I let a moment pass before answering. "We'll discuss the arrangements when the time is right." "Of course. I just want to make sure you're not carrying all of this alone." "I appreciate that, Dorian. I'll be in touch." I ended the call. The dining room was quiet. Through the doorway, I could hear Henrietta moving in the kitchen, the low sound of water running a cabinet closing. I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window. The mist had cleared. The front lawn was sharp and green in the October light. The kind of green that only shows up right before everything starts dying for the season. Now, because it matters, and because I have learned that the people who listen to stories like this deserve to understand how things actually work, let me explain what Dr. Kitt had written, and what he had not. Dr. Ambrose Kitt had been my personal physician for 18 years. A quiet, careful man who practiced out of Yale New Haven Hospital and who had in nearly 2 decades never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was something different. I trusted him completely, which was precisely why I had gone to him with this particular request. What I asked of him was not falsification. It was precision of a different kind. He had written what is called a personal opinion letter, a document that exists entirely within the bounds of standard medical practice in the United States. A physician may write such a letter based on existing patient history, prior test results, and clinical observation, without conducting new diagnostic procedures. It carries the weight of professional judgment, but it is explicitly subjective, one doctor's assessment, not an official diagnosis from a hospital or institution. Kitt's letter referenced real data, inflammatory markers from blood work taken in 2022, an area of density on a CT scan from 2023 that had been monitored and found stable but never formally disclosed to Dorian. The language was careful. In my clinical opinion, given the current indicators and patient history, prognosis is uncertain and warrants serious consideration of a limited timeline. No Yale letterhead, no official hospital seal. Signed with his name alone on plain paper. Enough for a son who wanted to believe it, not enough to challenge in any court. And there was a second layer to why Dorian would not seek a second opinion, at least not quickly. For 20 years, I had managed every medical relationship this family had. Our physicians, our specialists, our records, all of it ran through me. For Dorian to go around that, to seek independent verification, he would have had to say out loud to himself, if no one else, that he did not trust his dying father's doctor. That kind of move reveals motive, and Dorian was too careful to reveal motive before he had to. Henrietta came in from the kitchen and set a glass of water on the table beside me, the way she sometimes did without being asked. She did not look at me directly. She turned and went back the way she had come, quiet as always. I looked at the glass, then I looked at my hands folded on the table in front of me, still the way I had trained them to be still through years of work that required it. Hands that had been inside people's chests. Hands that had held instruments with tolerances measured in millimeters. I was not in pain. That was the thing worth saying clearly. What I felt sitting in that dining room after the call was not grief and not guilt. It was something colder and more precise than either of those. It was the feeling of a man who has just confirmed with complete certainty something he had hoped for. 30 years was not true. I could no longer make excuses for my son, not to Eleanor's memory, not to myself. 6 to 9 months, that was all the time I needed, not to say goodbye but to finish what I had started. Waverly arrived that Friday the way she always did, quietly with a book tucked under one arm, and more going on behind her eyes than she ever said out loud. She was 11 years old and small for her age, which people tended to mistake for fragility. It was not fragility. It was economy. She carried only what she needed and gave away only what she chose to. She had been coming to Harmon Estate every Friday since she was 8. The arrangement made permanent after her mother, Nora Caldwell, left Greenwich 3 years ago, under circumstances I did not yet fully understand but intended to. Waverly attended Greenwich Academy on a full academic scholarship, the school's youngest student ever to place in the state mathematics competition. She arrived that afternoon with her advanced calculus textbook and a thick hardcover history of the Second World War. And she said hello to Henrietta with the particular politeness of a child who meant it. I met her at the side door. We did not make a production of greeting each other, never had. I took her bag, she kept her books, and we went to the back garden, the way we usually did on Fridays when the weather still allowed it. The stone bench near the row of white pines had been our spot for 3 years. I had the Wall Street Journal. She had her homework. We sat with the comfortable silence of two people who had long since stopped needing to fill the space between them with noise. After perhaps 20 minutes, a small bird landed on the garden fence 3 feet from where we sat. Waverly looked up from her notebook. "What kind is that?" "American goldfinch. They go brown in winter, but they always come back yellow." She wrote it down in the margin of her notebook, not the name I noticed, but the behavior. Goes brown, comes back yellow. That was Waverly. She was never interested in what things were called. She was interested in what they did. That was also, I thought, why I trusted her. Now, because this is the part of the story that requires some explaining, I need to go back 2 weeks before Waverly arrived that Friday. Back to when I had made a different kind of arrangement, one that had nothing to do with attorneys or opinion letters. I had contacted Vincent Crowe. Vincent was not a lawyer and not a physician. He was something harder to define, a man who had spent 40 years operating at the precise edge of what systems could and could not track, and who had never, in all that time, crossed a line that mattered. I had worked with him since 1998. I trusted him the way you trust a surgeon you have never had to watch make a mistake. What I asked of him was simple 5 audio recording devices commercially available, no different from what any homeowner could purchase at an electronics store. Small, reliable, nothing sophisticated. Vincent sourced them and delivered them to Pete Marlowe without involving me directly in the transaction. Connecticut, it is worth knowing, operates under what is called one-party consent law. Under Connecticut general statutes, a homeowner may legally record conversations that take place in their own residence without notifying the other parties provided at least one participant in the conversation. In this case, myself is aware the recording is occurring. I was aware. Every device placed in my house was placed legally in rooms where no reasonable expectation of complete privacy existed. The main hall, the sitting room, the dining room, and the second-floor corridor. The 5th device went into the study adjacent to Waverly's room, not because I had any interest in recording an 11-year-old doing homework, but because that particular room was where Dorian invariably settled when he visited drinking coffee and making phone calls while I was elsewhere in the house. Pete installed all 5 on a Tuesday morning, while Waverly was at school and I was in Hartford. By that evening, the house had ears. What I had not planned was for Waverly to find one. She discovered it that Friday night, somewhere after 9 o'clock, when she went into the study to retrieve a reference book. I learned later that she had a habit of checking her surroundings when she entered a room, not out of suspicion, but out of the same systematic attention she applied to everything. She noticed the device behind the second shelf because it was slightly out of alignment with the books around it, a detail most adults would have missed entirely. She did not come to find me. She did not call out for Henrietta. She sat down in the desk chair, looked at the device for a long time, and then looked out the window, where Pete Marlowe was completing his evening perimeter check along the east fence line. And then, according to what she told me days later, she opened her notebook to a clean page and began to draw. She spent the next 2 hours moving quietly through every room she was permitted to enter, locating 2 more devices and marking each position in her notebook with a small symbol of her own invention. She did not disturb any of them. She did not tell me what she had found. She went to bed at 11:45. I saw the light under her door go dark after what I could only assume had been the most methodical 2 hours of any 11-year-old's Friday night. The reason she stayed silent was not fear. It was not confusion. It was the same reason she had written down "goes brown, comes back yellow," instead of just writing "goldfinch." She needed to understand the behavior before she named the thing. She had found 3 devices in her grandfather's house placed with obvious deliberateness, in rooms where certain conversations happened. She was not going to ask what they were until she understood why they were there. That was not a child panicking. That was a child doing what she always did, collecting data until the picture was complete enough to act on. The next evening, Dorian arrived without notice, and Waverly sitting quietly in her room with her notebook open to a page of small, careful symbols, retrieved the audio playback from the device she had found in the study, and heard something in those recordings that gave her the answer she had been waiting for. I didn't know any of that yet. I stood at the library window that Friday night and watched the light in her room still on at 11:45, still and unmoving, and told myself it was nothing, that she had fallen asleep reading about the Second World War. I didn't go check. I don't know why. Perhaps I already knew somehow that whatever was happening behind that door was hers to finish before I was allowed to see it. I didn't know what she had found that night, but the light in her room stayed on until nearly midnight, and when I passed her door, I heard no sound at all, not even the turning of a page. He arrived unannounced the way people do when they want to catch you at something. I had been expecting him for 4 days. The doorbell rang at 7 o'clock exactly. Dorian had always been precise about time, one of the few habits I recognized as genuinely his own, untouched by calculation. Henrietta answered the door while I waited in the hallway, and I heard the particular sound of a man who has decided before he walks through a door exactly what kind of entrance he intends to make. He came in carrying a bottle of Bordeaux and wearing the kind of easy smile that takes practice, tall like me, with Eleanor's coloring and none of her warmth. He was 44 years old and looked like a man who spent money on looking like a man who didn't need to spend money. The suit was understated in the way that only expensive suits manage to be. He hugged me at the door, both arms the right amount of pressure held for the right number of seconds. I found myself counting 3, 4, released at 5. I had performed that same calculation on 3 continents in operating rooms, timing sedation intervals, monitoring responses. It was an old reflex. It told me what I needed to know. Dad. He held my shoulders at arm's length for a moment, looking at my face with the focused concern of a man who had rehearsed it. You look good. You really do. Come in, I said. Henrietta's been cooking. He moved through the house the way water moves through a familiar channel, not because he was at ease, but because he knew the layout and had decided to use that knowledge as a form of authority. He had grown up inside these walls, which gave him a certain right to navigate them. But there is a difference between moving through a space you were raised in and moving through a space you are measuring, and I watched him make that distinction with every step. In the sitting room, he paused near the antique cabinet along the east wall, the one where I kept business files going back to the early 90s. His eyes stayed on it for 3 full seconds. The cabinet was locked as it had been for 20 years. He said nothing about it. He moved on to the oil painting above the fireplace, a Connecticut coastal landscape from 1923. Purchased at auction the year Eleanor and I were married. 2 seconds there. His expression did not change. He was not admiring it. Henrietta had prepared roast chicken for dinner. Dorian had called her that afternoon. It turned out to let her know he was coming, though he had not extended the same courtesy to me. It was his childhood favorite, and she had made it the way she always had. With the same herbs Eleanor had grown in the kitchen garden, before the garden became something I maintained mostly out of stubbornness. Both Dorian and I noticed the dish when we sat down. Neither of us mentioned it. The dinner conversation followed a pattern I recognized: health questions at the right intervals, the right amount of expressed concern, nothing that pushed too hard. He asked whether Kit had discussed treatment options. I told him we were still evaluating. He nodded with the gravity of a man absorbing information he would later find useful. Waverly came downstairs at 7:30. She appeared in the doorway of the dining room. In the quiet, unhurried way she did, most things took in. The scene registered Dorian's presence and settled on an appropriate response. She was wearing the green cardigan she favored on cold evenings and carrying a book she had clearly not been reading. "Hi, Uncle Dorian." "Waverly." He looked at her across the table. "How's school treating you?" "Fine, thank you." One beat. "May I be excused, Grandpa? I have some reading to finish." I told her, of course. She said goodnight to Dorian politely, precisely at the right volume, and left the room. I watched her go up the stairs through the open doorway. The back of her green cardigan disappeared around the second landing. Dorian did not look up from his plate. That was the moment. Not the questions about the estate, not the survey of the rooms, not the careful hug at the door. That small, unthinking absence of attention, a 44-year-old man who could not be bothered to watch an 11-year-old girl walk up a flight of stairs in her own home. She had spoken to him. She had said goodnight. He had answered with his eyes on his food. I filed it away without comment, the way you file away the things that confirm what you already know. After Henrietta cleared the plates, Dorian leaned back in his chair, in the manner of someone preparing to say something casual. "Dad, have you given any thought to simplifying things a bit? The estate is a lot to manage. Maybe Silas could look at restructuring before..." He stopped, let the sentence hang. I looked at him steadily. "Before what, Dorian?" A short pause. "Before things get more complicated, medically." "Everything is in order," I said. He nodded and smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that reached almost far enough. Almost. At 9:30, he put on his coat in the front hall and embraced me a second time. The same duration as the first. 5 seconds exactly. I walked him to the door and watched him go down the front steps to his car, a dark gray sedan. Connecticut plates, new enough to be unremarkable. He raised one hand without looking back, got in, and drove down the front drive between the oak trees. And I stood in the doorway until the headlights cleared the gate. When I turned around, Henrietta was standing at the far end of the hall, folding a dish towel. She did not look up. She did not say anything. 22 years in this house had given her the particular skill of being present without being intrusive, and she exercised it now, the way she always did, with complete and absolute accuracy. He had walked through every room in the house that evening, every single one, and I realized he wasn't visiting. He was taking inventory. She knocked on my office door at 7 in the morning. Waverly never knocked. She always waited to be invited. That Sunday, she knocked. I had been awake since before 6, sitting at the desk on the ground floor with the recording device from the sitting room in front of me. I had retrieved it after Dorian left the previous evening, and had spent the better part of an hour listening to everything it had captured. I knew what was on it. I had not yet decided what to do with the knowing. Then the knock came. She opened the door before I could answer, another thing Waverly did not ordinarily do, and walked straight to the desk. She was wearing the green cardigan from the night before, which told me she had not slept much either. In her hand was a single sheet of notebook paper, folded once. She set it on the desk in front of me without a word, pulled the chair from the corner of the room, sat down and looked at me, the way she looked at a problem she had already solved, and was now presenting for verification. I unfolded the paper. It was a hand-drawn diagram, the floor plan of Harmon Estate rendered from memory, with a precision that surprised me, even knowing who had drawn it. 4 small symbols marked 4 distinct locations: the main hall, the sitting room, the second-floor corridor, and the study adjacent to her room. Each symbol was accompanied by a small notation in her handwriting, tight and even. She had found 4 of the 5 devices Pete had installed. The one in the dining room had gone undetected, perhaps because she spent less time in that room, or perhaps because she had decided 4 was enough to understand the pattern. I looked at the diagram for a moment, then I looked at her. "Grandpa," she said, "are you in trouble? There are questions that deserve the full weight of a careful answer, and questions that deserve honesty above everything else." At 7 in the morning, with an 11-year-old sitting across from me, holding a hand-drawn map of my surveillance operation, I chose honesty. "Not yet," I said, "but I may need your help." Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but a kind of recognition, as though that answer confirmed something she had already suspected. She nodded once slowly, and then told me what she had heard. The previous evening, before Dorian had put on his coat, he had made a phone call from the sitting room. She had heard it through the device she had located there, not live, but on playback from the small recorder. She had, with a resourcefulness that still gives me pause, figured out how to access from the device's external memory port. Dorian had called a man named Trace Mullen, his personal assistant at Harmon Industries, the one who managed his schedule, filtered his correspondence, and, as I had come to understand, did a number of other things that never appeared on any official job description. The call had lasted 4 minutes. She had listened to it twice. He said, "The old man is holding things tighter than I expected. We need to move before he locks down the trust." She was reciting from memory, eyes level, voice steady. Then the other man asked about me. She paused. "And he said, she goes back to her mother. We'll handle it through the courts if we have to. She's not family trace. She's leverage." The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. I watched her hands. They were flat on the desk on either side of the folded diagram, and the right one had begun to tremble, a small, almost imperceptible movement that she was clearly trying to suppress. She was not looking at me. She was looking at a point somewhere on the surface of the desk, with the focused expression of someone concentrating very hard on not doing something. I stood up, walked around the desk, and placed my hand on her shoulder. "He's wrong," I said. 2 words. I did not elaborate. Some things do not need elaboration. They need to be said simply and left to stand on their own. She nodded, still not looking up. 30 seconds passed. Then she took one slow breath, squared her shoulders under my hand, and raised her head. Her eyes were dry. Whatever she had needed those 30 seconds to manage, she had managed it. That was Waverly. Not the absence of feeling, the decision to feel it privately and then move forward. I sat back down and told her what she needed to know. Not everything, because she was 11 years old, and some of the weight of this was not hers to carry yet, but enough. I told her that the devices had been placed legally in my own home, and that Pete had handled the installation. I told her that I had been aware for some time, that Dorian's intentions toward the estate were not what he presented them to be, and that I had begun to take certain precautions. I told her that her role, if she chose to accept it, was simple: to continue doing exactly what she had already been doing. Listen, document, tell me what she heard. "You don't need to do anything that puts you at risk," I said. "Pete is always on the grounds. Henrietta is always in the house. Nothing about your routine changes." She considered this for a moment with the particular stillness she brought to problems worth solving. "Does Henrietta know?" she asked. "Parts of it," I said, which was true in the way that most things are partially true. She nodded, then after another moment, "Grandpa, if this works, do I have to leave?" I looked at her across the desk, at the hand-drawn diagram between us, at the green cardigan and the dry eyes and the 30 seconds it had cost her to get there. "That," I said, "is exactly what I'm trying to prevent." She left my office at 7:42. I sat there for a long time after looking at her diagram, thinking about the fact that I had not planned for her to be this involved. I had planned for devices and attorneys and a quiet war conducted entirely among adults. But she had found the devices herself, listened to the recordings herself, drawn the map herself, and walked through my door herself at 7 in the morning. She had made that choice, and I was not going to take it from her. Silas Underwood had been my attorney for 26 years. He was the only man I knew who read contracts the way other men read poetry, looking for what had been left out, not what had been put in. I drove to Hartford alone that Monday morning. Pete had offered as he always did, and I had declined as I did whenever the destination was something I could not afford to have witnessed. His job was to protect the estate. Mine on this particular morning was to do something that needed to happen in a room with exactly 2 people in it. Silas kept his office on the 8th floor of a building on Capitol Avenue, the kind of office that had accumulated authority slowly over decades the way good law firms do. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that had probably belonged to someone's grandfather. The kind of room that reminded you that certain things in this world still moved at the speed of deliberation rather than transaction. I had always found it settling. That morning, I found it necessary. He was waiting when I arrived. He did not offer coffee, which meant he had already read something in my tone when I called to schedule the meeting. Silas operated on inference the way surgeons operated on anatomy. He knew where to look without being told. I set 3 things on his desk. The first was a copy of Dr. Kitt's personal opinion letter. Silas read it without expression. When he finished, he set it down and said, "Personal opinion, non-binding, not subject to institutional challenge." He paused. Smart. The second was Waverly's hand-drawn diagram, the floor plan. With its 4 small symbols, her notation system precise and unambiguous. Silas looked at it for a long moment. He did not ask where it came from or who had drawn it. 26 years had taught him that there were things I would explain when explanation was necessary and things I would not. The third was a sealed envelope. "Read the letter first," I told him. "Then open the envelope." He already had. Inside the envelope was a draft of a new will, 3 pages handwritten, the kind of document that carries intention rather than finality, but leaves no doubt about direction. The liquid assets of the Everett Harmon estate, investment portfolios, cash holdings, everything that could be transferred without a court proceeding, totaling approximately $14 million directed in full to the Eleanor Harmon Foundation for Child Welfare, an organization that did not yet exist, but would, the moment Silas filed the appropriate paperwork. Nothing liquid for Dorian, not $1. Harmon estate itself, the property, the house, the 4 acres of Greenwich land that had belonged to my family since 1887, to be left to whoever demonstrated primary and consistent care for the well-being of Waverly Harmon, as determined by the executor and verified by an independent guardian appointed by the court. Silas read the draft twice, then he looked up. "Well, this will be contested," he said. "I know, that's why I need the second part." I told him about Nora Caldwell. For those who have not been following this closely enough to remember, Nora was Waverly's mother. She had left Greenwich in 2019, when Waverly was 5 years old. The circumstances of her leaving were not what most people assumed, and I want to be precise about them here, because she deserves that precision. In the spring of 2019, Nora had discovered that Dorian was systematically transferring personal assets into corporate accounts held by Harmon Industries subsidiaries, a practice that, in Connecticut, constitutes fraudulent transfer under state law and is specifically prohibited in divorce proceedings. She had begun to document what she found. Dorian discovered this before she had gathered enough to act on. He did not threaten her directly, that was never his style. Instead, he retained attorneys far better resourced than hers, moved to restrict her access to joint finances, and began a slow, methodical process of legal isolation that made her position in any custody dispute progressively untenable. Nora left because staying gave her nothing. She left believing correctly, as it turned out that her only path back to Waverly was to wait for the right moment, build a stable and documented life elsewhere, and return when the ground had shifted in her favor. She had been living in Seattle for the past 3 years, working as a project manager for an architecture firm, maintaining a clean record and a quiet existence that would hold up under any level of scrutiny a family court might apply. After Dorian moved Waverly to the estate in 2022, not out of affection, but because having a child in his Manhattan-adjacent life had become inconvenient, I had established a private email address through an intermediary service and sent it to Nora through a channel only the two of us knew existed. I had been watching Dorian carefully enough by then to understand that the time would eventually come, and I did not want to be unprepared when it did. 3 weeks ago, I had sent her a single message outlining what I intended to do. She had replied within 4 hours. If Nora files for custody, Silas said, Dorian will fight it. He has more resources. He has more money, I said. I have more time, and now I have a plan. Silas looked at me for a moment with the expression he reserved for situations that were simultaneously legally complex and personally inadvisable. It was a look I had seen perhaps a dozen times in 26 years, and it had never once stopped him from doing the work. I'll need to draft proper language for the will, he said. That phrase, primary and consistent care, needs to be defined precisely enough to survive a challenge. I'll also need to begin the paperwork for the foundation. How long? A week for the foundation filing. The will language, I'd want another conversation before I put it in final form. I stood up and put on my coat. I thanked him, which was something I did rarely enough that he always took it seriously when I did. He was already reaching for a legal pad before I had cleared the doorway. Silas watched me leave without a word, which meant he was already working. That was the best sign I could have asked for. I saw her car turn into the front drive at 2 in the afternoon, a rental silver out-of-state plates. She drove slowly the way people do when they're rehearsing what they're going to say. I had been watching from the library window for the better part of an hour, not because I was anxious, but because I understood the weight of what was about to happen in my backyard, and I wanted to be present for it in whatever way a man can be present for something he has set in motion but cannot control. Nora Caldwell was 38 years old. The last photograph I had of her was from 2021, a Christmas card she had sent to the estate addressed to Waverly, which Dorian had intercepted and which Henrietta had quietly retrieved from the recycling and placed in my desk drawer without comment. In that photograph, Nora had looked tired in the particular way of someone who was holding everything together through sheer discipline. The woman who stepped out of the rental car that Wednesday afternoon looked different. The tiredness was still there, but it had changed texture, less like desperation, more like the settled exhaustion of someone who had made their decision and was now living inside it. Her hair was shorter than I remembered. She was wearing a dark coat, practical shoes, and carrying a thin manila envelope in her right hand, the kind that holds documents meant to be filed rather than read for pleasure. Silas's counterpart in Seattle had prepared the initial custody modification petition. Silas had reviewed it for Connecticut procedural compliance. Everything in that envelope had been looked at by 2 sets of careful eyes before it ever touched her hands. I met her at the side entrance. Henrietta, who had known Nora was coming since Monday and had said nothing about it to anyone, opened the door before I reached it. The 2 women looked at each other for a moment, 6 years of absence compressed into a single exchange of eye contact, and then Henrietta stepped aside and went back toward the kitchen. "He's expecting you," she said, which was her way of saying welcome back without using the words. I brought Nora into the sitting room rather than the office. The office was for transactions. This was not a transaction. She sat across from me with the envelope on her knee and her hands folded over it. Up close, I could see the effort it was costing her to be still. Not nervousness exactly, more like a person who has been moving towards something for a very long time and is having difficulty adjusting to the fact that they have finally arrived. "Ah, she's in the back garden," I said. Nora looked at me for a moment. Then she stood up, set the envelope on the cushion beside her, and walked toward the rear of the house without asking which door to use. She remembered. I did not follow her outside. I positioned myself at the sitting room window, close enough to see far enough that neither of them would feel watched, and I stayed there. Waverly was on the stone bench by the white pines, her back to the house, a book open across her knees. She had not been told Nora was coming. I had made that decision deliberately not to be unkind, but because I needed whatever happened between them to be real, not rehearsed. 11-year-olds in my experience perform for audiences. They do not perform when they are caught genuinely off guard. Nora crossed the lawn slowly. When she was perhaps 15 feet from the bench, Waverly heard the footsteps and turned. What happened in the next 30 seconds was something I have thought about many times since, and I am still not certain I have the right words for it. Waverly looked at the woman walking toward her. Her expression moved through something I could not fully read at that distance recognition. Then something complicated, then a careful retreat back behind stillness, as though she needed to make a decision before she allowed her face to finish reacting. She looked down at her book. Nora stopped 3 steps away and stood there. Waverly. One word. Her voice carried across the garden to where I stood at the window. There was a tremor in it, not a collapse. Just the sound of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, being allowed to loosen slightly at the edges. Waverly raised her head. "All, Mom." Not quickly, not with the momentum of a child who has missed someone and finally has permission to show it. Slowly, carefully. The way you say a word you have not said in so long that you need to hear it out loud to confirm it still belongs to you. She did not get up from the bench. Nora did not close the remaining distance. They stayed where they were, 3 steps apart, looking at each other in the October afternoon light. Henrietta appeared at my shoulder. She stood beside me at the window for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. Then she went to put the kettle on. I stayed. When Waverly eventually went back inside 40 minutes later, quieter than usual, but steady on her feet, Nora came and sat across from me again. She picked up the envelope without being reminded. "The petition has been filed," she said. "My attorney submitted it this morning to Hartford County Family Court. Silas reviewed the procedural language last week." She paused. Silas flagged the filing as an emergency modification. The recorded conversation and Dorian's documented behavior toward Waverly gave us sufficient grounds to request an expedited hearing date. The court can move within 3 to 4 weeks under those conditions. Another pause. Dorian will be notified within 48 hours. I know. And if he fights it, he will fight it, I said. That's not the question. The question is what it costs him to fight it in time, in attention and resources directed away from everything else he's trying to do. This is step 3 of 9, Nora. I don't need him defeated right now. I need him distracted. She absorbed this for a moment. Does Waverly know how much of this involves her? She knows enough, I said, and she chose to know it. Something shifted in Nora's expression at that. Not quite relief, not quite grief. The particular look of a mother, hearing that her child had been brave in her absence. She left that evening with the manila envelope which now contained Silas's signed letter of procedural support, alongside her attorney's filing confirmation. Before she reached the door, I opened the center drawer of the hall table, where I kept a small collection of things that mattered without requiring explanation, and took out a photograph. Waverly at 7. In her first year at Greenwich Academy, standing in front of a chalkboard with the slightly startled expression of someone who has just been told to smile and wasn't quite ready. I handed it to Nora without explanation. She looked at it for a long moment. She did not say thank you. She didn't need to. Nora left that evening with a folder of legal documents and Waverly's old-school photo, the one I'd kept in my desk drawer. I hadn't planned to give it to her, but some things you don't plan. Trace Mullen was the kind of man who believed loyalty was a matter of arithmetic. I simply made sure my numbers were higher than Dorian's. I had his contact information from Vincent Crowe, who had made it his business over the years to know the organizational charts of every company in which either of us held even a marginal interest. Harmon Industries was not marginal. Vincent had been watching it, and everyone inside it for longer than Trace had been working there. I arrived at the Grey Cup 15 minutes early. It was a habit I had carried over from medicine. You learn quickly in that profession that the person who controls the room controls the conversation, and controlling the room begins with being in it first. I chose a corner table near the window, with sightlines to both the entrance and the street. Ordered black coffee. Opened the Wall Street Journal to a page I had no intention of reading, and waited. Trace walked in at 11 o'clock exactly. He was 36 years old and had the particular look of a man who had been competent enough to rise and not competent enough to stop noticing that the people above him didn't deserve to be there. Medium height, good suit that was slightly too new, the kind of purchase a man makes when he wants to look like he belongs somewhere he isn't sure he does. He spotted me before he reached the table. which meant he had looked up my photograph before coming. Prepared then, and still here. That told me what I needed to know. He sat down without ordering anything. That told me something too. I set the newspaper aside and placed a manila envelope on the table between us, not pushing it toward him, just placing it there, the way you set down a fact rather than an accusation. 3-wire transfers, I said. Conducted between April and July of this year, routed through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Total value: approximately $2.3 million. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, transfers of this structure are required to be reported to the IRS. These were not. The Department of Justice takes an interest in that kind of omission, particularly when the transfers originate from a company with outside investors who were not informed. I let that sit for a moment. Your name appears on the authorization paperwork for the July transaction. An administrative signature, I understand that. You signed what was put in front of you. But signatures have a way of becoming relevant in ways no one anticipates. Trace looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it. "What do you want?" he said. His voice was even, which told me he had considered this possibility before sitting down. People who are genuinely surprised don't sound even. 3 things, I said. First, you continue working for Dorian exactly as you have been. No change in behavior, no indication that this conversation occurred. Second, sometime in the next 2 weeks you place a document on his desk. I'll provide it. It will contain terminology related to genetic analysis. No conclusions, no official header, no laboratory identification. Just data that can be interpreted. You don't explain it. You don't draw attention to it. You simply make sure he sees it. And third, you send me a brief message through an intermediary account I'll give you before you leave when he's seen it and what his reaction was. That's all. Trace was quiet for a moment. What's the play here? I'm not asking you to understand it, I said. I'm asking you to do it. He looked out the window for a few seconds. On the street outside, a woman was walking a dog past the cafe window. An ordinary Wednesday in October, the kind that had nothing to do with any of this. Then he looked back. And the envelope. If you do what I've described, it goes into a shredder in my office. You have my word on that, for whatever it's worth to you. And if I walk out of here and call Dorian in the next 10 minutes, then it goes to the DOJ's Financial Crimes Division by end of business, along with a note explaining that your signature appears on page 4. I paused. I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to betray Dorian out of loyalty to me. I'm offering you an exit from a situation you already know is going to end badly for everyone in proximity to it. You've been in that office long enough to see which way this is going. He didn't answer immediately. That was interesting. A man who had made up his mind to refuse doesn't need time to think. A man who has already been thinking about something like this, about what it would take. About what it might look like to step sideways before the wall comes down. That man needs a moment to recognize that the moment has arrived. Fine, he said. One word. No negotiation, no counteroffer, no conditions. The speed of it confirmed what I had suspected the moment he walked in and sat down without ordering. He had not come here prepared to say no. He had come here prepared to say yes and wanting someone to make it easy enough. I slid a card across the table. The intermediary email address handwritten. He pocketed it without looking at it. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left without touching his coffee. I watched him cross the street and disappear around the corner. Then, I picked up my own cup and finished it slowly, looking out at the ordinary Wednesday that was still happening outside the window. He left without touching his coffee. I sat there and finished mine. And I thought the most useful people in a chess game are rarely the queens. They're the pawns who know they're pawns. Ambrose Kit had been my personal physician for 18 years. He was also the only man who would ever talk me out of something once. He was trying again that Friday. His office was on the 6th floor of Yale New Haven Hospital, in a wing that smelled of floor wax and recycled air, and the particular institutional quiet that settles over medical buildings in the middle of the afternoon. The room itself was spare in a way that felt deliberate. White walls, no photographs, a single diploma's frame above the filing cabinet, and nothing else personal anywhere. Kit did not bring his family into his workspace. He had told me once that medicine required a specific kind of distance, and that distance was harder to maintain when you were surrounded by reminders of the people you went home to. I had understood that completely. I had kept Eleanor's photograph in my library, not my old office. He was standing at the window when I came in looking out at the harbor. New Haven's waterfront in October had the particular gray-green quality of a painting that hadn't decided what season it was yet. He turned when he heard the door. "Everett." He gestured to the chair across from his desk and sat down himself. Between us, he had placed a manila folder thicker than the one I had left with him 2 weeks ago. "These are your actual results," he said, opening the folder to the first page. "From April, complete panel." He turned it to face me across the desk. "You're in better shape than most men your age. Your inflammatory markers are within normal range for someone who has managed chronic stress for several decades. The density on the 2023 scan has not changed in 2 years. It is, as we discussed then, almost certainly benign." "I know," I said. "I know you know." He closed the folder. I wanted to say it out loud, in this room, so that we're both clear about what the letter I wrote actually is and what it is not. What Kit had written was a personal opinion letter, a document entirely within the bounds of acceptable medical practice in the United States. A physician may write such a letter based on a patient's existing history, prior test results, and clinical observation, without new diagnostic procedures. The letter carries the weight of professional judgment, but it is explicitly and legally subjective, one doctor's assessment issued under his own name on plain paper, without institutional affiliation or the formal diagnostic codes that constitute an official medical record. Kit's letter had drawn on real data, the mild inflammatory markers from 2022, the area of density on the 2023 CT scan that we had both agreed to monitor rather than declare. The language he had chosen was careful, and it was chosen carefully. In my clinical opinion, given current indicators and patient history, prognosis is uncertain and warrants serious consideration. No Yale letterhead, no diagnostic conclusion, no falsehood, only the particular precision of a statement that was true in the way that all ambiguous things are technically true. And Dorian would never have received that information from Kit independently, because Dorian was not Kit's patient. Under Haifea, a physician's obligation runs entirely to the person in the chair, which was me. What I chose to share with my son about my own medical situation was my decision and no one else's. Dorian could try to challenge it, Kit said, if he brought in his own physician and ran independent tests. "He won't," I said. "Not yet. To do that, he'd have to say out loud that he doesn't believe me, and that reveals something he's not ready to reveal." Kit nodded slowly. He had the manner of a man who had accepted an answer without being satisfied by it, a distinction he was careful never to hide from me, which was part of why I trusted him. "And Waverly," he said. "Does she know how much of this involves her?" I paused. Not long, perhaps 2 seconds. But Kit had spent 18 years reading the pauses in my answers the way other physicians read test results. "She knows enough to have chosen to be part of it," I said. He stood up then, moved to the window the way he did when a conversation was about to change direction. He had done it before in this same room. The one time in 18 years he had succeeded in making me reconsider something. "I've known you a long time, Everett. I've never seen you do anything small, but I've also never seen you use an 11-year-old as a piece on a board." "I'm not using her," I said. "I'm protecting her." He turned from the window and looked at me directly. "Are you sure there's a difference?" The room was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of 2 men who had known each other long enough to sit without speaking the other kind, the kind that has weight in it. I did not answer him, not because I didn't have an answer. I had an answer. I had constructed it carefully over weeks, tested it against every angle I could find, and it held. The difference between using someone and protecting them was not semantic. It was structural. Waverly had found the devices herself. She had drawn the diagram herself. She had knocked on my door at 7 in the morning and handed me her work. Every choice had been hers. But Kit wasn't asking about structure. He was asking about something older and less precise than that. the thing that lives underneath the architecture of a justification and doesn't always survive contact with a question asked by a man who knows you well enough not to be impressed by your reasoning. I sat with it, and in that silence I understood why he had asked. Before I stood to leave, he asked one more thing. If this works, what happens to Dorian? I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. He gets exactly what he wanted, I said, just not the way he imagined it. Kit looked at me for a moment with the expression he reserved for answers that were complete without being satisfying. Then he gave a small nod and turned back toward the window. I let myself out. I drove back to Greenwich in silence. Kit's question stayed with me the entire way, not because I had no answer, but because the answer I had was not the one he had been looking for. And I was no longer completely sure that didn't matter. 3 weeks had passed since my conversation with Dr. Kit. In that time, Dorian had called me twice, both times about the estate. Once about the heating system, and once about a contractor bid for the east wing roof. Not once about my health. Not once about the prognosis he had heard in 3 sentences over the phone in early October. The trap was set. Now came the bait. The kitchen at Harmon Estate was the warmest room in the house in the early mornings. Not because of any particular design, but because Henrietta arrived at 6 and had the coffee on by 6:15. And 30 years of that particular habit had given the room a kind of accumulated warmth that had nothing to do with the radiators. The smell of it reached the second-floor landing. Before you were halfway down the stairs, dark roast a little bitter, the same blend she had ordered from the same Hartford supplier since 1997. Eleanor had chosen it. Henrietta had simply never seen a reason to change it. I ate breakfast in the kitchen most mornings now. The dining room was for occasions. The kitchen was for days. Henrietta set the newspaper beside my coffee cup. At the usual time, the usual way folded to the front page, positioned, so I could read the headline without picking it up. The headline was about a transit referendum in Hartford. I did not pick it up. She noted this without comment and went back to the counter, where she had eggs on and toast in the rack and was moving between both with the particular economy of motion that comes from doing the same thing in the same kitchen for a very long time. I was waiting for an email. It arrived at 8:47. The sender address was a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been given the key. The intermediary account I had set up for Trace Mullen before he left the Grey Cup 3 weeks ago without touching his coffee. The account routed through a server in Vermont that Vincent Crowe had recommended, and its only purpose was to receive a single message confirming that the document had been delivered and that Dorian had seen it. I opened the email on my tablet and read it twice before I set the device face down on the table. Trace's message was brief, which was how I had asked him to keep it. On Friday, October the 31st, he had placed the document on Dorian's desk while Dorian was working through his afternoon correspondence. The approach had been exactly as discussed, casual. Incidental, nothing that could be read as deliberate. Something from the old files, sir. Looked like it might relate to the estate matters. Then he had stepped back and let Dorian find his own way to it. According to Trace, what followed was, this Dorian picked up the document, read it, set it down, picked it up again, read it a second time more slowly. Then he set it down and said, without looking up, where did this come from? Trace gave the answer we had agreed on, that he had found it in a folder of documents Everett Harmon had transferred to the office 2 years prior, and that it had struck him as possibly relevant. Dorian said nothing further. He moved on to the next item in his correspondence pile. But Trace had counted over the course of that afternoon. Dorian returned to the document 3 more times. Each time he read it in full. Each time he set it face down when he was finished with the particular deliberateness of a man who does not want anyone to see what he has been looking at. Now, because this matters, let me describe what the document actually was. It was a single sheet of paper with the header genetic profile confidential printed in plain type across the top. No date, no laboratory name, no institutional seal or accreditation number. No issuing physician, no case reference number, no chain of custody notation of the kind that any legitimate laboratory document would carry. Below the header, 2 columns of alphanumeric data, allele frequencies marker designations. Percentage figures, the kind of terminology that appears in genuine genetic analysis reports and means something specific to someone trained to read it, and something entirely self-determined to someone who is not trained but is highly motivated to reach a particular conclusion. There was no summary, no conclusion section, no language that stated what the numbers meant or did not mean, just the data, arranged to look like the middle portion of a larger document, as though the cover page and interpretation section had been separated from it at some point, leaving only the raw figures behind. This was the mechanism, and it was a simple one. A person searching for evidence that Waverly was not biologically connected to Dorian would look at that document and see precisely what they were searching for. The human mind, when it wants something to be true, is extraordinarily capable of supplying the missing interpretation. A person with no such agenda would set it aside as incomplete and meaningless, the fragment of something they didn't need to understand. Dorian had read it 4 times in a single afternoon and set it face down each time. That told me everything I needed to know about which of those 2 categories he had placed himself in and how long he had been in it. I closed the tablet and picked up my coffee. "Good news or bad?" Henrietta said. She was at the counter, not looking at me, attending to a dish towel with a level of focus it did not require. "Depends on who you ask," I said. She didn't ask anything further. In 22 years, she had developed a precise and reliable instinct for which answers were the end of a conversation and which were the beginning of one. This was the end. Waverly came downstairs at 8:55, already in her school coat, her bag over one shoulder. She moved through the kitchen with the efficient purposefulness of someone who had somewhere to be and had organized herself. Accordingly, opened the refrigerator, took an apple, closed it with her elbow. She was halfway to the side door before she slowed. She had her grandmother's way of entering a room and reading it before she said anything in it, and she had apparently read something in mine. "Did something happen?" she asked. "Nothing you need to think about today," I said. She looked at me for a moment, the particular look of a child, assessing not whether you are telling the truth, but whether you are protecting her from something she will need to know eventually. She had learned over these past weeks to distinguish between those 2 things, with a reliability that I found both reassuring and sobering. She took a small bite of the apple, gave a single nod, and went out through the side door. I listened to Pete's voice outside, a brief exchange of good mornings, as he walked her to the end of the drive where the academy car would collect her. Then the sound of gravel under tires. And then quiet. She trusts me, I thought. I need to be worth that. It was the same thought I had carried out of Dr. Kitt's office 3 weeks ago, sitting in the silence after a question I had not answered. It had not resolved itself in the weeks since. I was beginning to think it was not the kind of thought that resolved. I carried my coffee upstairs to the library and pulled open the center drawer of the desk. Under a small stack of correspondence was a page from a desk calendar. I flipped forward to November and found the date Silas had confirmed 2 weeks ago, circled in blue ink. November 12th, Hartford County Family Court, first custody hearing. 9 days away. The oak trees outside the library window had gone past their October gold and were beginning to thin, the branches showing through more clearly each morning against a sky that had settled into the particular flat gray of a Connecticut November. The garden below looked quieter than it had a month ago, more deliberate, as though the season itself was preparing for something. I set the calendar page on the desk and looked at it. Dorian would call within 48 hours. The document had done what it was designed to do, not manufacture a belief, but confirm one he had already been carrying. The question was not whether he would act on it. The question was what he would say, and whether he would say it to me directly, or find a way to say it around me. Before I show you what happened the night Dorian walked through that door with the document comment, "I'm ready," below. Because what he didn't know was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment, and so had the recording device in my pocket. A small note: what you're about to hear contains some details shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. If this isn't the kind of content you're looking for, this is a perfectly fine place to stop. No one is keeping you here, but I have a feeling you'll want to stay. He arrived at 6:30 on a Wednesday, unannounced again. People only stop announcing themselves when they've decided they already own the place. I had been in the library when I heard the doorbell, not the quick double ring of someone uncertain whether they had the right house, but a single, deliberate press held just a beat longer than necessary. Henrietta's footsteps crossed the hall below. I did not go down immediately. I took the small recording device from the desk drawer, where I had kept it since the night I stood on that darkened staircase in early October, clipped it inside the breast pocket of my vest, and pressed the single button on its side. Then I went downstairs. I want to be clear about the recording, because clarity matters here. Connecticut operates under one-party consent law. A conversation may be legally recorded by any participant in that conversation without notifying the other parties. I was a participant. I had been carrying that device most evenings for the past month, not in anticipation of any single night, but because a man who has listened to his son plan around him from a darkened staircase does not leave that kind of thing to chance a second time. Dorian was already in the sitting room when I came down, the coat still on, standing near the fireplace with his hands in his pockets. He had a bottle of something with him. I noticed it on the side table, unopened, the kind of gesture that was about optics rather than intention. Dad, the same easy warmth he always deployed at the beginning of these visits. You look well. How are you feeling? Have you had the follow-up with Kit yet? We went through the motions for approximately 10 minutes. I answered his health questions with the same measured vagueness I had been using since October. He asked whether Silas had been in touch. I said we had spoken. He nodded, satisfied with the rhythm of the conversation, which was his first mistake of the evening. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and set the document on the coffee table between us. Dad, he said, his voice dropping into a register. I recognized the tone of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and is now performing the unrehearsed version of it. I think we need to talk about Waverly. I looked at the document on the table. I did not pick it up. There are some inconsistencies, he continued, in the biological record. I'm not drawing conclusions, I just think for Waverly's sake, we owe it to her to clarify her situation properly. And perhaps while you're managing everything with your health. He paused, recalibrating. Perhaps it would be better for her to transition to a different living arrangement, something more structured, something that gives her stability. Different living arrangement. I turned toward the window. 4 seconds. I know it was 4 because I counted them the way I counted seconds in an operating room, not to track time, but to give my hands something to do other than what they wanted to do. My right hand had closed into a fist at my side. I had not decided to do that. It had simply happened the way the body sometimes acts before the mind has issued instructions. I was not angry in any way I had words for. What I felt was older than anger and less clean. He was talking about an 11-year-old girl, a child who had spent 3 years in this house, who had taught herself to find devices planted in walls, who had sat across a desk from me and handed me a hand-drawn map with her name written in the corner, and he was discussing her the way a man discusses the rearrangement of furniture, where to put her, what to do with her, what category she belonged in. I needed 4 seconds to make sure that when I turned back around, the voice that came out of my mouth was the one I had built over 74 years, and not the one that had been waiting underneath it since October 1st. I turned around. I see, I said. My voice was level. And have you spoken with Nora about this? Something happened in his face, a movement so small that anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime reading the micro-expressions of people under stress would have missed it entirely. A brief stillness in the muscles around his eyes. A fractional reassessment. Nora isn't relevant, too. She's Waverly's mother, Dorian. I said it without emphasis, the way you state a fact that requires no argument. Under the law, she is very relevant, particularly now. The last 2 words were deliberate. I watched him receive them. He understood in that moment that I knew about the custody petition, that the move he had assumed was being made behind his back had been made with my knowledge, possibly with my involvement. I let him sit with that for a moment. I did not confirm it. I did not deny it. I simply watched his face rearrange itself around a problem he had not included in his calculations. My phone buzzed on the side table. I glanced down. A text message. 3 words from a number I recognized without needing to see the name. I heard him. I looked at the message for exactly the time it took to understand that Waverly had been upstairs this entire evening, that the device Pete had installed in the main hall ran its signal to a receiver she had learned to access from her room, and that she had been listening from the moment Dorian walked in. I stood up. "I need to take this," I said, gesturing toward the phone in a way that suggested a call rather than a message. I walked out of the sitting room and into the hallway without looking back. Henrietta was standing at the far end of the corridor. She had not been summoned. She was simply there. The way she was always simply there, a woman who had watched Dorian Harmon grow from a boy into whatever he had become, and who had developed over 22 years a particular quality of stillness that was more eloquent than most people's sentences. She looked at him through the open doorway with an expression that held no surprise and no warmth, only the quiet verdict of someone who had known for a very long time. Exactly what she was looking at. Dorian stood up. He picked up his coat. He left the unopened bottle on the side table and walked out the front door without a word to either of us. I stood in the hallway and read Waverly's message again. I read her 3 words one more time. I heard him. And I understood she had been in this house the entire time. She had heard everything, and she had chosen to tell me in exactly the way that left no trace. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper. I had been in courtrooms before, but always as a witness on the other side of the testimony box, with someone else's questions determining the shape of the conversation. That Tuesday, I was the one watching. It was a different kind of discomfort, and in certain ways a more honest one. Hartford County Family Court. Hearing room on the 3rd floor was smaller than I had expected. 12 rows of wooden benches, a raised bench at the front. 2 counsel tables separated by a strip of carpet worn thin by decades of people who had come here to fight over things that mattered to them. Tall windows along the left wall let in the flat gray light of a mid-November morning, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything but makes everything easier to see clearly. A clock on the rear wall read 8:52 when I arrived. Nothing about the room was designed to comfort anyone. I had always thought that was the correct approach for a place where truth was supposed to matter more than comfort. I took a seat in the second-to-last row on the side away from both parties. I was not a party to this proceeding. I was a witness to it in the older sense of that word. Nora sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight and deliberate, in the way of someone who has been preparing for a moment for a long time, and is determined not to waste it by appearing uncertain. She had worn a dark navy coat that she had not removed, and she held a pen in her left hand that she did not use. Silas Underwood sat beside her, not as lead counsel, but as co-counsel with specific expertise in Connecticut estate and family law. A yellow legal pad in front of him, with 3 columns of notes in his small, precise handwriting. Across the aisle, Dorian sat with Marcus Webb, who had represented Harmon Industries in 3 separate litigation matters over the past decade. Webb was a skilled attorney. His consistent limitation was that he performed best when the ground was stable and worst when it shifted without warning. Today the ground was going to move more than once. Judge Harold Fenwick had presided over Hartford County Family Court for 19 years. He was 66, and he ran his courtroom with the efficiency of someone who had heard every argument twice and had no patience for its 3rd appearance. He was not the kind of judge you influenced through connections. He was not the kind you charmed. He was the kind you simply had to be correct in front of, which suited me fine. The first matter before the court was the DNA evidence. Silas rose and presented a certified genetic analysis report from a laboratory in Boston, one of a small number of facilities in New England accredited by the AABB, the American Association of Blood Banks, whose accreditation is the standard accepted by family courts across the country for paternity and relationship testing. The report confirmed, with a statistical certainty of 99.997%, that Waverly Harmon was the biological child of both Dorian Harmon and Nora Caldwell. To obtain the comparison sample, Nora had provided her own DNA voluntarily. Silas had filed a motion 2 weeks prior requesting access to Waverly's existing pediatric records standard procedure in custody proceedings, and the court had granted it without objection. No new sample from Waverly had been necessary. Webb objected to the report's admissibility on procedural grounds. Judge Fenwick overruled him in 11 words. The laboratory is AABB accredited. The report is admitted. He did not look up when he said it. The document Dorian had placed on my coffee table 9 days earlier, no date, no laboratory name, no issuing institution, no conclusions, was not entered into evidence by anyone. It couldn't be. Numbers without provenance are not evidence of anything except the intention of whoever printed them. The second matter was the recording. Silas placed a small speaker on the council table and played 2 minutes and 14 seconds of audio. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something definitive is about to be heard. I listened from the back row to my own voice, measured and calm. Then to Dorian's smooth, deliberate, careful with its phrasing in the way people are careful when they believe they are being responsible rather than recorded. I heard him say, different living arrangement. I heard him say something more structured. From 12 rows away, I watched the back of his neck stiffen slightly in the middle of the second minute. It was the only physical indication he gave that he understood what was happening to him. Webb was on his feet before the recording finished. Your Honor, this recording taken out of context does not establish intent to... I'll hear the objection after I've listened to it twice, Fenwick said. He was already writing. He listened to it twice with complete attention and made 2 further notes on his pad. Then, I'll note it for the record. Which was precisely what it meant. It existed, it was documented, and nothing filed later would remove it from the history of this proceeding. Then Lena Marsh took the stand. Dr. Lena Marsh was a licensed clinical psychologist retained by Dorian Harmon 6 weeks prior to conduct a psychological evaluation of Waverly. She was 45 years old, had maintained a private practice in Westport for 11 years, and held a faculty appointment at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. By every credential, she was exactly the expert witness Dorian had needed her to be. 3 days before the hearing, Silas had sent her a copy of the November 5th recording as a matter of professional transparency. I do not know what she did that evening. I know only that she arrived the following morning and asked to speak with Silas before the proceedings began. When she took the stand, she did not look at Dorian's table. She read her report in a clear, unhurried voice. Waverly Harmon presents as a psychologically well-adjusted child with a strong problem-solving orientation, high cognitive function, and secure attachment patterns consistent with a stable primary care environment. She demonstrates age-appropriate emotional regulation with above-average resilience indicators. There is no clinical basis for recommending a change in her current living situation. Any such change, absent compelling evidence of harm in the existing environment of which I found none, would present unnecessary disruption to a child who is by every measurable standard thriving. The room stayed quiet when she finished. Webb did not object. There was nothing to object to. It was her honest professional judgment rendered under oath, according to APA ethical standards, and any challenge to it would only have underscored the fact that she had been engaged for one purpose and had delivered another. I sat in the second-to-last row and thought about the people in this room who had not been part of any plan I had made. Lena Marsh, who had listened to 2 minutes of audio and decided that her professional integrity mattered more than her client's expectations. The guardian ad litem, a woman named Aldridge, court-appointed and entirely independent, who had spent 40 minutes with Waverly the previous week, and now presented her findings in 3 measured paragraphs. The child wished to remain at Harmon Estate. The child wished to have her mother present in her life on a consistent basis, and both wishes aligned with every observable indicator of her well-being. Judge Fenwick, who had been doing this for 19 years and had no stake in any outcome except the correct one. None of them had been placed here by me. They had looked at what was in front of them and told the truth about it. That was not something I had arranged. It was something I had hoped for, which is a different thing entirely, and in my experience, a considerably rare one. Judge Fenwick delivered the temporary order at 11:47. Primary temporary custody to Nora Caldwell, effective immediately with the condition that she establish residence within 30 miles of the Harmon Estate for a 60-day monitoring period. Supervised visitation for Dorian Harmon on alternate weekends, with a court-appointed supervisor present for the initial 90 days. Everett Harmon, designated as residential supervisor, recognized by the court as the individual who had provided consistent care for the minor child over the preceding 3 years. Dorian walked out of that courtroom without looking at anyone. His face had the color of old paper. Webb was beside him, speaking quietly, and Dorian shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in the contained manner of a man recalibrating rather than accepting. I stayed in my row until the room had mostly emptied, looking at the worn strip of carpet between the two counsel tables, and thinking about Lena Marsh reading her report in that clear, unhurried voice, and about the fact that I had not put her there. Some things, it turns out, arrange themselves if you give them enough time and enough room to do so. I walked out into November air and called Waverly. She picked up on the first ring. "It went well," I said. "I know," she said. "I've been counting the minutes." I didn't ask how she knew. Henrietta found me in the kitchen that Thursday afternoon, which was unusual. I was ordinarily the one who found her. She was standing at the center island when I came in a small brown prescription bottle on the counter in front of her. She had not opened it. She had simply set it there, the way you set down a piece of evidence before you explain what it means. I looked at the bottle, then I looked at her. "Dorian called me yesterday," she said. She told it plainly the way Henrietta told everything. No editorializing, no visible emotion, just the facts arranged in the order they had occurred. Dorian had telephoned in the mid-morning. He had expressed concern about my health, about whether I was keeping up with my medications, about whether she felt she had the support she needed to ensure I was being properly looked after. Then he had told her a package would arrive by courier that afternoon, containing a supplement that had been recommended for men in my condition. He had asked her to make sure I took it with dinner each evening. She had not opened the package. She had called Dr. Kit instead. Kit had identified the contents from the label description she read to him over the phone, a mild sedative compound available by prescription, not commonly associated with any treatment protocol for pancreatic cancer or any related condition. Not dangerous in the doses described, not enough to cause lasting harm, enough taken consistently over several weeks to produce fatigue, intermittent cognitive slowing, and the kind of visible deterioration that photographs well and reads poorly in legal settings. Not poison, manipulation in tablet form. Now, because this is the part that requires some untangling, let me explain what Dorian thought he knew and why he was wrong about all of it. Several weeks prior, Trace had allowed a detail to surface in one of his regular exchanges with Dorian that Henrietta had been administering some kind of supplement to me each morning, something she kept in the kitchen that hadn't been there before. This was true. The supplement was a multivitamin compound Kit had recommended after my April blood work iron B complex, nothing that required a prescription or warranted a second glance. Trace had described it as something unspecified, not from the usual pharmacy. Dorian had heard this and constructed a story around it. In his version, Henrietta was already operating outside her role, already providing me with something off the books already, perhaps, susceptible to a different kind of arrangement. He had reached for that interpretation because he needed it to be true, because a Henrietta who could be redirected was far more useful to him than a Henrietta who couldn't. And he had misread her completely. In 22 years, I was not certain anyone had ever correctly read Henrietta Voss except Henrietta Voss. "Return it," I said. "Unopened." She nodded. That was settled. But she didn't move to leave. She stood on the other side of the island, her hands flat on the counter, and looked at me with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for the right moment to say something, for longer than she should have had to wait. "Everett," she said. In 22 years, she had called me Mr. Harmon and occasionally Sir, and once on the day Eleanor died, nothing at all because there was nothing to say. She had never called me by my first name. I understood from that single word that what followed was not going to be a conversation between employer and employee. I have worked for this family for 22 years. I've kept secrets I shouldn't have kept, and stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. She paused. "I won't be the thing that hurts that girl." "You're not," I said. "You're playing chess with real people, Everett. Real people bleed." I didn't answer. There was a version of an answer, the same one I had constructed for Dr. Kit in New Haven, the one about structure and intention and the difference between using someone and protecting them. I knew that answer well. I had tested it from every angle. It held. But Henrietta wasn't asking for architecture. She was standing in her kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, having just declined to poison a man on behalf of his son. And she was telling me something that did not require a counter-argument. It required a witness. I just make sure, she said, that when this is over, she still has a grandfather, not just a strategist. She picked up the brown bottle, held it for a moment, and set it in the small basket near the door, where outgoing packages were kept. Then she went back to whatever she had been doing, before I walked in with the complete and characteristic efficiency of a woman who had said what needed to be said and saw no reason to say it twice. I sat down at the kitchen table. The room was quiet. Through the window above the sink, the back garden was gray and still the oak stripped nearly bare, now the stone bench by the pines empty. I had sat at that bench with Waverly 6 weeks ago and told her the name of a bird. Dr. Kit had asked me whether I was sure there was a difference between using someone and protecting them. I had not answered him. I was sitting with the same question now, in a different room, and it had not gotten any easier to answer in the weeks between. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after she left, and I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for 6 weeks was, I doing this for Waverly or for myself? The final custody hearing lasted 40 minutes. I timed it. It felt longer. Hartford County Courthouse, in the morning, had a different quality than it had 3 days prior, less anticipatory, more deliberate. The same worn carpet, the same fluorescent light over the bench, the same Judge Fenwick in the same black robe, but the room felt settled in a way that preliminary hearings never do. Everyone present understood that today was the day something was going to be decided rather than considered. Nora sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded and her back straight, the posture of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and has decided that when it arrives, she will meet it without flinching. Dorian sat across the aisle with Marcus Webb, whose expression throughout the proceedings had the careful neutrality of a lawyer who knows the numbers are against him and is conserving energy for the next fight. Judge Fenwick read the final order at 10:17 in the morning. Full legal and physical custody of Waverly Harmon awarded to Nora Caldwell, effective immediately. Dorian Harmon to retain scheduled weekend visitation rights, with a court-appointed third party present for all visits during the initial 90-day period. The court noted on the record that Everett Harmon had provided a stable and consistent care environment for the minor child over the preceding 3 years, and that this contribution had been considered in determining the supervisory arrangement going forward. 40 minutes. I had timed it from the moment Fenwick took the bench to the moment he set down his pen. In my experience, the things that change the direction of a life rarely take as long as you expect. I watched Dorian receive the order. His face did not move. Not a tightening around the eyes, not a shift in his jaw, nothing that would read to anyone watching less carefully than I was as anything other than composed acceptance. But I had been watching that face for 44 years. What I saw was not acceptance. What I saw was a man running calculations. Not have I lost, but what do I still have? And what is the fastest path to it? Webb leaned over and said something close to his ear. Dorian listened, gave a single nod, and stood when the proceeding was adjourned. He did not look at Nora. He did not look at me. He walked out of that courtroom the way a man walks out of a meeting he intends to continue somewhere else. I stayed until Nora had gathered her documents and her attorney had finished a brief exchange with Silas. When she passed my row on her way out, she paused for a moment. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. There are things that don't need to be said between two people who have both spent years waiting for the same outcome, and this was one of them. Silas's office that afternoon smelled of coffee and recent printing, the particular combination that meant he had been working since early morning. He had a folder on his desk when I arrived. The previous evening, I had called Silas and asked him to extend an invitation to Dorian for a brief meeting framed at my instruction, as a preliminary discussion of estate documentation that required Dorian's awareness as next of kin. It was Everett Harmon's estate. Silas was Everett Harmon's attorney. The meeting was entirely at my direction, and I was present. Dorian, still believing he was walking into the better half of the day, was already seated across from him. That was expected. Dorian had lost the custody decision. He had come to the will reading, or what he believed was a preliminary discussion of it, because he still believed he knew what the second half of this day contained. He was about to learn otherwise. Silas opened the folder and read from the first page without preamble. All liquid assets of the Everett Harmon estate, including cash holdings, investment portfolios, and financial instruments totaling approximately $14.2 million, shall be transferred in full to the Eleanor Harmon Foundation for Child Welfare, upon the death of Everett Harmon. He set the page down. The Eleanor Harmon Foundation had been incorporated in Connecticut 6 weeks prior. Its stated mission was the provision of legal and educational support for children in contested custody. Situations a mission that Silas had worded carefully and that I had approved without amendment. It was by every legal measure a legitimate charitable organization. It was also the destination of every dollar of liquid wealth I had accumulated in 74 years of work. I watched Dorian process this. He was still, in the way of a man who has received information that does not match his model of the situation and is quietly revising the model rather than reacting to the information. Then Silas turned to the second page. The Harmon estate property located at its registered address in Greenwich, Connecticut, shall be transferred to the individual who has demonstrated primary and consistent care for the well-being of Waverly Harmon, as determined by the appointed executor and verified by the guardian ad litem of record. I watched the calculation continue behind Dorian's eyes. He had lost the custody order, which meant under the language Silas had just read, that the primary caregiver designation would fall to Nora, or to me, or to some combination, not to him. The $14 million was gone, but the estate, the house itself, the property. The land that had held the Harmon name since 1887, he believed that was still navigable. So the house, he said, the property transfers to you as next of kin, Silas said, without looking up from the folder, subject to all existing encumbrances and obligations of record. What encumbrances? Silas glanced at his watch with the practiced timing of a man who had spent 26 years knowing exactly when to pause. That's a conversation for tomorrow, he said. Dorian left Silas's office believing he had won the second half of the day. I left knowing the second half hadn't started yet. I invited Dorian to dinner that evening. He came, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident he still felt. He arrived at 6:30, no wine this time, no pretense of a gift. He walked through the front door, the way a man walks into a room he already considers his own, unhurried, slightly proprietary, pausing a half-second longer than necessary in the main hall. I noticed. I always noticed. Henrietta had cooked pot roast, the same recipe she had used every third Sunday for 22 years, Eleanor's recipe, written on a yellowed index card that still lived in the second drawer of the kitchen cabinet. The smell met us at the hallway, slow-braised beef rosemary, a faint sweetness from caramelized onion. Whatever Dorian was feeling, when he stepped through that door, the smell of that kitchen briefly interrupted it. Even he couldn't pretend otherwise. Waverly sat across from him at the dinner table, picking carefully at her carrots, saying very little. She had a particular kind of stillness when she sensed that the adults around her were operating on a frequency she wasn't fully cleared to receive. She didn't push. She observed. I had long stopped being surprised by that. Dorian made conversation. He asked Waverly about her mathematics coursework, listened with practiced attentiveness, nodded at the right moments. He asked about a history project. He used her name twice in 4 sentences, a technique, not warmth. Waverly answered each question politely, completely, and gave him nothing extra. Dinner lasted 40 minutes. When Waverly excused herself, kissing my cheek before she went upstairs, Dorian watched her go, with the expression of a man recalculating a column of figures he thought he'd already totaled. He didn't say anything about the custody ruling. Neither did I. Henrietta brought coffee. She set Dorian's cup down, without looking at him, which for Henrietta was its own form of communication. I waited until the coffee had cooled slightly. Then I reached beside my chair and placed a manila folder on the table between us. "There's something we should go over," I said. "Before you make any decisions about the estate." Dorian looked at the folder without touching it. Silas mentioned encumbrances. Silas used the right word. He opened it then with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who has trained himself not to show anticipation. The first page was a certified copy of the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office designation dated September 1987. The Harmon estate had been formally listed under the Connecticut Historic Preservation Act for 38 years. The listing was comprehensive: no demolition, no structural alteration, no change of use without prior written approval from the State Historic Preservation Officer. Any violation carried civil penalties and, in egregious cases, criminal exposure. The state retained the right of first refusal on any sale at a price determined not by market appraisal, but by a state-assessed figure recalculated every 5 years. The most recent state valuation, dated March 2024, placed that figure at $4.1 million. The market value of the property, as Dorian well knew, sat at approximately $8.5 million. The second page was a summary from the estate accountant accumulated property tax arrears and preservation compliance assessments totaling $3.2 million, due and payable in full upon any transfer of ownership. Under the terms of the preservation designation, the accumulated debt transferred in full with the deed upon any change of ownership. No Hartford area lender had been willing to extend financing against a title carrying encumbrances of this size. Both banks had said as much in writing. The debt transferred with the deed. The third page was a letter from 2 Hartford area banks, both of which had declined to consider mortgage lending against the property. Their reasoning was identical. Outstanding preservation debt rendered the collateral legally encumbered beyond acceptable risk thresholds. I watched Dorian read. He was a methodical reader. He had always been a methodical reader, and he went through each page without expression, without speed, without any of the small physical tells that most people produce when they encounter information that rearranges their plans. He finished the third page, set it flat on top of the others, and placed his hands on the table. Then he sat silently for approximately 20 seconds. I did not fill the silence. I had waited 46 years for a silence worth keeping. His hand moved to his face, not covering it, just resting against his jaw fingertips at his cheekbone. The gesture of a man running a calculation that keeps returning the same answer, no matter how many times he resets the variables. The estate he had been maneuvering toward for the better part of a year carried a $3.2 million debt he could not finance, could not defer, and could not escape by sale. The sale price was capped by state appraisal at $4.1 million, leaving him less than $900,000 before tax and transaction costs insufficient to cover the debt and maintain the property through even a single fiscal year. Annual operating costs ran between $180,000 and $220,000. The historic designation prevented him from converting the property to any commercial use that might generate offsetting revenue. He owned or would own a liability dressed in 1890s stonework. "There's no path through this," he said finally, not a question. "I've lived here for 41 years, I said. "I know every inch of it, including the parts that cost money to keep standing." He said nothing further. He stood, retrieved his coat from the chair back, and buttoned it with the same meticulous precision he applied to every physical task. He did not say goodnight. He did not look toward the staircase where Waverly had gone. He walked to the front door, and Henrietta appeared in the hallway. I still don't know exactly how she always knew when to appear, and she held the door without a word. He left. I sat alone at that table for a long time after he was gone. The pot roast had gone cold. I ate it anyway. Eleanor always said a cold dinner tastes the same as a hot one, if the reason you're eating it is the right one. Monday morning, I found Henrietta standing in the kitchen with her tablet completely still. Henrietta was never still. She heard me come in and turned without a word, holding the tablet out in my direction, the way someone holds out evidence they wish they hadn't found. The kitchen smelled of coffee already brewed and toast already cooling. She had been standing there long enough for both to go unattended. I took the tablet, the Hartford Courant online edition. The headline ran in bold across the top of the page. Inside, the Harmon estate dispute. Financial Irregularities, a Child, and a Father's Calculated Moves. By Cecilia Drum, investigative reporter. I set the tablet on the counter and poured my coffee first. Then I sat down and read. Cecilia Drum had been covering corporate finance and family law at The Current for 11 years. I had never met her. 4 months ago, I had sent a single anonymous email from a temporary account. 3 lines, no attachments, no names, only a suggested direction. Offshore transactions, April through July, Harmon Industries. What she built from that 3-line suggestion was 3,200 words of precise, sourced investigative journalism that had clearly taken the better part of those 4 months to construct. The article opened with a timeline of Harmon Industries' internal restructuring over the preceding 3 years. It named 3 offshore wire transfers totaling $4.7 million, routed through a registered Cayman Islands shell entity, none of them declared in the company's annual financial disclosures to the IRS. It cited 2 former Harmon Industries employees unnamed, described only by their tenure and departmental roles, who had described irregular approval processes for vendor contracts. One contract in particular, awarded to a construction firm with documented ties to a Dorian Harmon business partner, carried markings of a conflict of interest that had never been disclosed to the company's minority stakeholders. The middle section was quieter, but no less precise. Cecilia had located 3 separate settlement agreements from internal disputes over the past 5 years. She could not quote their terms, as the agreements contain non-disclosure provisions, but she could and did confirm their existence through public court filings, a detail that required no confidential source at all. The existence of the agreements was public. Their size, she noted, was not small. The final section of the article covered the custody proceedings. Every word of it was sourced from Hartford County Family Court records documents that any member of the public could request and receive. The November 12th temporary order. The November 15th final, ruling the appointment of a residential supervisor. Dorian Harmon's name appeared 9 times in that section. My name appeared twice. I finished reading, put the tablet down, and picked up my coffee. Waverly came into the kitchen a few minutes later, in her school clothes backpack already over one shoulder. She looked at my face, then at Henrietta's, and she didn't ask. She took an apple from the bowl on the counter, said, "Good morning," and walked through to the living room. I heard her stop. I followed her to the doorway. She was standing at the living room window, looking out at the garden. Overnight, the first real snow of the season had arrived, not a heavy fall, but enough to settle over the oak branches and the stone bench and the garden path, turning everything outside into a version of itself that was slightly quieter and slightly smaller than usual. Waverly stood with her apple held at her side, not eating it, just watching. I stayed in the doorway. My phone rang. I stepped back into the hallway before answering. Dorian's voice was entirely composed. That was the first thing I noticed, the absolute deliberate composure of a man who had rehearsed the call before making it. "Did you have anything to do with that article?" "I read the paper like everyone else," I said. A short silence. "Webb says we have grounds for a defamation suit." "Webb is a fine attorney," I said, "but defamation requires the statements to be false." A longer silence this time. Then the line went dead. I stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the phone. Through the living room doorway, I could see the back of Waverly's coat still at the window, still looking out. I put the phone in my pocket and walked in to stand beside her. Outside, the snow was coming down, in light unhurried flakes settling into the oak branches the way snow does when there's no wind to complicate things. The stone bench where Waverly had been sitting the afternoon Nora arrived was now entirely white. The garden looked like something from a long time ago. We stood there for a while without speaking. "Is it over?" Waverly asked finally. "Almost," I said. She considered that. "How much is left?" "One more move." She nodded once slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing information rather than reacting to it. She took a bite of the apple. Outside, a small bird landed on the stone bench, looked around with the brief assessing alertness of small birds, and flew off again. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. The snow kept falling. The garden stayed quiet. somewhere on the other end of a disconnected phone line. Dorian Harmon was sitting with a newspaper article and a lawyer who could not help him with the one problem that mattered most, that the words on the page were true. I had one move left. I had saved it carefully the way you save the thing most likely to end the game cleanly. It had a name. Vincent Crowe. Vincent Crowe arrived the way he always did, precisely on time, with no announcement, as though time itself had agreed to step aside for him. He was 70 years old and carried it without apology. His hair had gone completely white sometime in his early 60s, and he had kept it short and neat ever since, in the manner of a man who had decided once how he wished to appear, and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Dark gray suit, no pocket square, no lapel pin. His shoes were black and polished to a degree that suggested habit rather than vanity. He carried a slim leather portfolio, the kind that contained exactly what it needed to contain and nothing else. When he walked into the library, he took in the room in a single quiet scan, the medical texts, the business binders, the violin in its glass case, and said nothing about any of it, because Vincent Crowe had never once commented on another person's space without a specific reason to do so. I had first called him in the spring of 1998, when I was transitioning from surgical practice into private real estate investment, and needed someone who understood how capital structures could be built to be simultaneously transparent and opaque legal at every layer, but comprehensible only to the person who had designed them. He had come recommended by a colleague who described him simply as the man you call when the architecture matters more than the speed. In 27 years of working together, he had never once given me advice I later regretted following, and he had never once told me something I wanted to hear if the truth happened to be different from it. Those two qualities, in my experience, rarely coexist in the same person. When they do, you hold on to that person carefully. He sat in the chair across from my desk, placed the portfolio on the surface between us, and opened it to a single typewritten page. "The position is clean," he said. "The SEC has no jurisdiction here. Private company, private debt, private equity. Everything is documented, everything is legal. You could hand this entire file to a federal examiner tomorrow morning, and they would have nothing actionable, not one line." I looked at the page. It summarized what we had spent the better part of 3 years constructing, with the particular patience that only becomes possible when you already know how the structure ends. In 2021, Harmon Industries had needed emergency capital. The pandemic had compressed margins across the company's commercial real estate holdings, and Dorian had been too proud or too careful about appearances to approach traditional lenders who might ask uncomfortable questions about how the company had arrived at its cash position. He had gone instead to a private investment firm called Crowe Harmon Capital, which had offered favorable terms, moved quickly, and asked very few questions. Dorian had believed the firm belonged to Vincent. That belief had been allowed to persist without correction, because correcting it would have required disclosing that 70% of Crowe Harmon Capital was held through a Delaware holding structure that traced, after 3 carefully constructed layers of corporate ownership, back to me. The loan stood at $9.4 million. The interest rate was variable, tied to the prime rate plus 2.25%, recalculated quarterly. The repayment terms were standard for a private lending agreement of this size, with one specific clause that Dorian's attorneys had reviewed and signed off on without apparent concern. The full principal balance and all accrued interest were callable upon 30 days written notice from the creditor. No cause required, no prior default necessary. 30 days written notice, full payment. The second item on the page concerned equity. Through the same Delaware holding structure, I held 34% of Harmon Industries as non-voting preferred shares. Non-voting meant Dorian retained operational control. He ran the company day to day without interference from my position. But under the company's articles of incorporation, any amendment to the core organizational documents required approval from holders of at least 67% of all outstanding shares, voting and non-voting combined. 34% was enough to prevent that threshold from being reached. Dorian knew those shares existed. He knew them only as belonging to the 2021 investment group. He had never pressed the question with sufficient specificity to receive an answer that would have been useful to him. "Why didn't you move earlier?" Vincent asked. The question was not a challenge. It was the kind of verification he performed at the end of every engagement, confirming that the reasoning behind a decision was as sound as the decision itself. If I had called the debt in September, I said, he would have known I was watching him. He would have become careful. I needed him to be careless enough to show the court, and to show me exactly the kind of man he was willing to be when he believed no one who mattered was paying attention. Vincent considered this for a moment. And now I don't need him careless anymore. I need him to stand completely still. He nodded once with the minimal economy of a man for whom a single nod was a fully complete sentence. He reached into the portfolio and placed a second sheet on the desk, a draft of the 30-day notice prepared on plain paper, no letterhead, requiring only a date and my signature. The language was precise and without flourish the way Vincent wrote everything. I did not sign it immediately. I looked at it for a moment, then set it to one side. Sometime in the preceding half hour, Waverly had passed through the hallway outside the library. I had heard her footsteps. She had her grandmother's particular habit of moving through the house with a kind of deliberate lightness, as though she was aware of the rooms around her and was making a conscious effort not to disturb them. There had been a brief pause just outside the library door, the specific pause of someone deciding whether to knock, and then the footsteps had continued on toward the back staircase. She had chosen to leave the room to whatever was happening inside it. That was also something she had inherited. Vincent reached into the portfolio a final time and placed one more sheet on the desk. It was blank, a placeholder I understood later for whatever came after Monday. He simply needed something in his hand when he said what he said next. Eleanor would have liked that child. He did not elaborate. Vincent never elaborated on things he had already stated precisely. He had met Waverly in the hallway at 4:30 during the brief pause I had heard outside the door, and whatever had passed between them in those 2 minutes had apparently been sufficient for him to reach a conclusion. Vincent formed conclusions quickly and revised them rarely. I looked at the blank sheet of paper on the desk. She would have, I said, 2 words. For the first time across the entire length of this plan, through all the months of careful work with Silas, with Nora, with Kit, with Trace, with every piece of it I had spoken Eleanor's name in the presence of another person and felt absolutely no need to explain, justify, or expand upon what I meant. Vincent had met her twice, in 2003 and again in 2007. He had not required more than 2 meetings to understand her. Some people don't. He left at 5:15 as precisely as he had arrived. The library door closed behind him with the quiet finality of a well-fitted door in an old house. Outside, the December light was doing what December light does in Connecticut, withdrawing early and without ceremony, leaving the oak trees standing in a gray that was almost blue, the garden below covered in 2 weeks of accumulated snow that had gone hard at the edges and soft again at the center. The stone bench where Waverly had once sat, reading on an October afternoon, was buried entirely. The garden looked reduced, patient, and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen. I sat at the desk and looked at the 30-day notice for a long time. Monday morning, that was when I would make the call, not to cause him pain that had never been the point, but to stop him, completely and permanently, in a way that left nothing capable of being reversed. The last Monday of the plan arrived cold and clear, the kind of December morning where the air is sharp enough to remind you that you are still alive. I had been up since 5, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness that comes when you have been preparing for something for a long time, and the morning of it finally arrives. I made no special ceremony of it. I dressed, went to the library, sat at my desk, and waited until 9 o'clock. At 9, I picked up the phone and called my son. He answered on the second ring. "Dad." "Dorian," I said. "I'm going to say this once. I need you to listen." A silence that told me he was already standing up from wherever he had been sitting. "You owe Crow Harmon Capital $9.4 million, I said. "I am Crow Harmon Capital. I can call that debt today this Monday. 30 days to settle the full balance in cash. If it goes unpaid, the creditor proceeds to asset attachment against Harmon Industries. That process, once initiated, cannot be paused by negotiation. The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality now. Not the rehearsed silence of a man composing his response. The genuine silence of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the last 4 years. Second, I continued, I hold 34% of Harmon Industries and non-voting preferred shares through the same structure. That's not enough to run the company, but it is enough to prevent any major transaction, any sale, any merger, any significant amendment to your articles from reaching the threshold it needs. Every large move you intend to make will require my agreement. I want you to understand what that means practically. A longer silence. Third, I paused here not for effect, but because I wanted the words to arrive one at a time. You will honor every term of the custody arrangement. You will not attempt to renegotiate it, relitigate it, or find procedural routes around it. I am not asking you to sign anything today. I am telling you that I have the means to make the alternative considerably worse than compliance, and I will use those means without hesitation if the situation requires it. When Dorian spoke, his voice was entirely level. That was the thing about my son. Even in the moments when the ground had fully shifted beneath him, he did not raise his voice. It was the one quality I had always respected in him, even when I could not respect much else. And if I agree, then the debt remains structured as it currently is under the existing terms. The equity position stays silent. You keep the company. A long pause. I heard him breathe once slowly the way a person breathes when they are accepting something they cannot change. You planned all of this. I planned it based on the understanding that you would be exactly the person you have always been, Dorian. Everything else, that part, was yours. The longest silence of the entire call. Then, fine. One word. The line went dead. I set the phone on the desk and sat in the library for 20 minutes after that. I did not read. I did not review papers. I sat in the room where I had spent 30 years reading, thinking, and making decisions that shaped the lives of people I loved, and I let the quiet of it sit with me one last time. The medical texts on the upper shelves, the business binders, the violin in its sealed glass case that Eleanor had bought at an estate sale in 1991 and placed there herself, saying it deserved to be seen even if it was never played. The early winter light coming through the window, falling across the oak trees in the garden below, which were bare now, and standing in that particular dignified way that bare oak trees have in December, as though they are simply waiting without distress. I picked up my bag and went downstairs. Henrietta was standing in the main hall. She had known, of course. Henrietta always knew. She was holding nothing, doing nothing, simply standing in the hall the way she had stood in halls of this house for 22 years, present and composed and entirely herself. You'll stay on to manage the estate until the transfers are finalized, I said. Of course, she said. A short silence. Then Henrietta did something she had not done once in 22 years of employment. She placed her hand on my arm lightly, briefly. The way you touch something you want to remember the weight of. She'll be fine, Henrietta said. I did not answer immediately. I looked at her hand on my arm, and then I looked at her face, which was the composed and honest face of a woman who had watched this family from close range for most of her adult life, and had formed her own conclusions about all of it. I know, I said. Waverly was standing at the foot of the staircase. She had come down quietly in her school coat, her backpack over one shoulder. Nora had told her the night before. I could see that she had processed it in the way she processed everything, completely privately and without leaving visible evidence of the work. I set my bag down and walked up 4 steps so that we were level with each other. She looked at me for a moment. You're not coming back? I'll be back for Christmas, I said, and the first Sunday of every month after that. You promise? On your grandmother Eleanor's name. She considered that the way she considered every piece of information seriously and without performance. Then she asked the question I had not anticipated in the quiet, direct way that she asked every question that actually mattered to her. Grandpa, did I do well? I looked at her face, 11 years old, steady eyes, a small crease of uncertainty at the corner of her mouth that she was working to keep still. She had found listening devices and mapped them in a notebook. She had waited 3 days before speaking. She had sent a 3-word text that left no trace. She had stood at a window in November snow and asked how many moves were left, and when I said one, she had simply nodded and taken a bite of her apple. "You did better than anyone I have ever known," I said, "and your grandmother Eleanor would have loved you completely." Waverly nodded once. She did not reach for a hug. She had never been a child who reached for hugs, and I had never required it of her. But she lifted her small hand and placed it over mine, where my hand rested on the banister between us. She held it there for 1 second, the particular weight of a child's hand light and certain at the same time. Then she let go, turned and walked back up the stairs. Pete had the car waiting at the front. He said nothing when I put my bag in the trunk, and I said nothing back. Because Pete Marlowe was a man who understood that silence could be its own form of respect. He drove down the long gravel drive and through the front gate without being asked. And I sat in the back seat and did not turn around. Not because I did not want to, but because I knew that if I looked back at the house, I would not be able to leave it. And leaving it was the right thing. Leaving it was the whole point. I had spent 40 years making precise cuts. The last one was the cleanest, and the only one that left a scar I did not mind carrying. Manhattan in December was loud in a way that Greenwich had never been. That first evening I sat in the darkened penthouse and looked down at the city lights spread across the distance below. And I thought, this is what winning feels like. Then I thought, no, this is what being right feels like. Those two things are not always the same. Someone asked me once whether I believed in God. I told them I believed in consequences, and that in my experience the two were rarely in disagreement. This has been a family story about precision, about what happens when a man waits long enough, watches carefully enough, and loves something deeply enough to do what is necessary, rather than what is comfortable. But I want to be honest with you, the way I was not always honest with myself. I am not a model worth following. I spent 40 years being right about almost everything, and I nearly lost the one thing that mattered most because I was too proud to speak plainly before the damage was halfway done. The devices, the letters, the financial architecture, none of it would have been necessary if I had said what needed to be said 20 years earlier to the people who deserve that honesty. Family betrayal does not begin with a single dramatic act. It begins in the small silences, the questions not asked, the warnings not heeded, the kindnesses that go uncounted until someone decides to count them differently. Eleanor counted them. I didn't listen. Every family story that ends in a courtroom started somewhere much quieter than that. Do not be like me. Speak sooner. Trust the people who have earned it, and protect the ones who cannot yet protect themselves before protecting them requires a plan. Family betrayal leaves scars that no amount of precision can remove, but love, the quiet, unglamorous daily kind, can work around them. That is my honest opinion, and I have lived long enough to mean it. This is the family story I carry. I hope it leaves you with something worth keeping. If it did, leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to stay for what comes next, you already know where to find us. Thank you for being here until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements constructed with the sole purpose of offering something worth thinking about. If that is not what you are looking for today, that is perfectly all right. Choose what serves you best.